Joining us for more on this conversation is Zerlina Maxwell, host of Mornings with Zerlina on SiriusXM, and Brendan Buck, former press secretary to former House Speakers Boehner and Ryan. He is an MSNBC political analyst. Zerlina, just polling this week that shows a majority of voters trusting Trump over the vice president when it comes to the economy. Now, the vice president did edge out Trump in one outlier, Financial Times poll, but what do you think the vice president has to do to close that gap?
I think she has to talk more about the economy, and you'll see that today when she's talking about the specifics. I think she needs to lay out a vision for how she's planning to tackle some of the most important issues top of mind for American voters, like housing and grocery costs, but also the cost of childcare and supporting paid family leave, things that parents and families are thinking about every single day as they go through their bank books and their bills and try to make ends meet. And I think that, it's about setting out a vision that is in a stark contrast to Donald Trump and his vision when he can talk specifics, which is rare. And I think that once she does that, I think these numbers will shift a bit. A lot of folks are unfamiliar with what the vice president has been doing for the last 4 years. And while the big picture and some of the economic indicators obviously have improved since the crash during COVID, I think people are slow to feel that every single day. And so it's on her to lay out her vision so that people understand how her policies will help them on the day-to-day basis.
And Zerlina, how does she either separate herself or join these last 4 years of the Biden administration's economic record?
Well, I think that she needs to remind folks where we were when Biden and Harris went into the White House. I think that one of the disturbing things Donald Trump does is try to change history and erase our memories of where the economy actually was when he left the White House. Well, when he was forced to leave the White House, because as we know, he did not want to leave. The economy crashed at the end of COVID. Now, the pandemic is not Donald Trump's fault, but he did not address many of the things that needed to be done in terms of keeping Americans safe so that the economy did not crash. Biden and Harris inherited that flailing economy, and they've built it back up step by step. And I think it's important to remind Americans that as Donald Trump tries to rewrite that history and say that he gave Biden a great economy, no, he did not. That is flatly untrue. And every single person knows that.
And Brendan, this, as the former president, is trying to, I guess, sharpen his attacks on Vice President Harris's economic record. Here's some of what he had to say yesterday.
She's running on the Maduro plan. We call it the Maduro plan, like something straight out of Venezuela or the Soviet Union. People don't respect her in the economy. Economists are laughing. They can't even believe this is happening to our country. And she wants to change a free enterprise type country into a communist type country. That's what she knows. She's considered far more radical than Bernie Sanders. That's all you have to know.
Brendan, how effective do you think this line of attack is going to be?
So that event yesterday could have been really good. I mean, they started off really focused on the price increases that people have shown in polls over and over again are they're really concerned about. And I don't know that Kamala Harris has a great answer for inflation. And she's putting out some policies to address that, I guess, this week. But that is a very good issue for Donald Trump. And he started off really focused on it. But then, as tends to happen, Donald Trump gets bored with his talking points. And so he deviates and goes into all of the greatest hits and starts talking about all these crazy things, and it gets lost. It would not be hard to be a Republican candidate right now and put a lot of pressure on Kamala Harris on the economy, make her respond, make her feel the heat. But he is so self-indulgent in talking about all these other random things that it doesn't break through. And so she never really has to respond to anything. It's another missed opportunity. I think it's why that a lot of Republicans are frustrated with his lack of discipline. I don't know it's going to change anytime soon. This is kind of who he is. But it was a perfect symbol of how a campaign that has so many opportunities keeps blowing them at every opportunity.
Zerlina, a new op-ed in the Washington Post reads in part, quote, if your opponent claims you're a communist, maybe don't start with an economic agenda that can accurately be labeled as federal price controls. Could this plan backfire on the vice president?
I don't think this plan is going to backfire on the vice president. I think that a lot of Americans are concerned with prices, and they do understand viscerally that price gouging is a real thing that is happening. And so implementing the power of the federal government to control the gouging and ripping off of the American public as they go to the grocery store every day, I think that that's something that will resonate with plenty of American families. I would also say that American families are concerned about housing and grocery prices, as you'll hear the vice president talk about. But as I said, they're also concerned with the care economy. And so I think that as she lays out this economic vision later today, she'll also begin to talk about the care economy, like affordable child care, paid family leave, and also the type of care that so many folks who have kids and also aging parents have to deal with, and really create a care economy that helps support American families who are feeling that pinch and don't have enough resources.
And Brendan, earlier this week, I'm just thinking of your comments about just how he is not able to focus on specific issues and keep that message as a focused one. Earlier this week, Nikki Haley warned that Trump can't win by attacking Harris personally and urged him to focus on issues. Here's how he responded to that.
I think I'm doing a very calm campaign. I mean, we're here. There's no shouting. I think I appreciate her advice. I have to do it my way. I ran against her, and I did it my way.
So it doesn't seem like, Brendan, he's even considering that anything that he says is not focused.
He is convinced that his political success is all from his own genius as a political operator. My personal view is he won in 2016 because a lot of people didn't like Hillary Clinton. And then, of course, he lost the second time that he ran. As much as he was defeating Joe Biden recently, it was mostly a function of the fact that people just didn't think Joe Biden was up for it. And it wasn't that Donald Trump himself was actually that great. His numbers have never been all that great. So he's never going to change that. He doesn't think more attention for himself, more outrageous things, playing the old hits is always going to work, because he surrounds himself with people for whom that's great. He loves going to those rallies and throwing those lines out and having everybody laugh at him. Like, that's what feeds him. So he's not going to change how he does that. And that's the circle that we find ourselves in. When you never get out of your bubble, you never realize that there are other people who react differently to the kind of things you say. And talking about your crowd sizes may rile up the people in front of you, but it does absolutely nothing for the people who are going to decide this election. I don't know that he can change who he is, though.